She arrived with nothing. He wanted to send her away. What happened next changed both of their lives forever. A 52-year-old widow, one worn suitcase, a train platform in the middle of nowhere, Montana, and a man who rode 12 miles just to tell her to leave. He never planned to let her stay. She never planned to need anyone. But when that train pulled away and left her standing alone in the freezing wind, something shifted inside Silas Boone, something he hadn't felt in years. This is not a story about a perfect love. This is a story about second chances. If this story moves you, drop your city in the comments. I want to see how far this story travels. Like, stay until the end. Let's begin. Montana Frontier, Autumn 1884. The telegram arrived on a Tuesday, which was already a bad sign. Nothing good ever came to Boone Ranch on a Tuesday. It was a Tuesday in March of 1879, when the creek flooded and drowned 14 head of cattle. It was a Tuesday 2 winters after that when Clara died, quietly, without warning, in the gray hours before dawn, her hand going cold inside his before he even understood what was happening. And now it was a Tuesday in the last week of October 1884, when the boy from the telegraph office rode out from Larkspur Bend with a small folded paper tucked inside his coat, looking nervous the way people always looked nervous when they had to deliver something to Silas Boone. Silas was mending a fence post when the boy arrived. He drove the last nail without looking up, then straightened slowly, pressing one hand to the small of his back the way a man does when 47 years have settled into his bones like cold weather. He took the telegram without a word, tipped the boy 2 cents from his vest pocket, and stood alone in the field reading it. He read it twice. Then he folded it, slid it beneath his suspender strap against his chest, picked up his hammer, and went back to mending the fence. But his hands weren't steady anymore. The telegram was from his sister, Edna Pruitt, who lived in Billings and had strong opinions about everything and had never once in her 61 years asked permission before acting on any of them. Silas, it read, I have made arrangements. A woman named Margaret Whitlock, widow, age 52, arrives Larkspur Bend Station, Friday the 31st, afternoon train from Billings. She is a decent woman, and you are a stubborn fool, living alone on that broken-down ranch like a ghost. Do not embarrass me. Do not embarrass yourself. Go meet her. Edna. There was a postscript because there was always a postscript with Edna. P.S. She has already agreed. It is done. The only question is whether you are man enough to show up. Silas stood in his kitchen that evening, reading it a third time by lamplight, the telegram spread flat on the table beside a plate of beans he hadn't touched. The lamp threw long shadows across the walls. The house was very quiet, in the way that empty houses are. Not peaceful, but hollow. The kind of quiet that has a weight to it. He thought about Clara. He always thought about Clara in this kitchen, because she had loved this kitchen more than any other room, had filled it with the smell of cornbread and wood smoke, and had once laughed so hard at one of his terrible jokes that she'd knocked an entire pot of soup off the stove. He'd never quite gotten the stain out of the floorboards. He looked at the stain now. He folded the telegram. No, he said aloud to no one. He was going to that station on Friday, and he was going to send Margaret Whitlock back to Billings on the very next train, and that was the end of it. Friday came the way Fridays do in October on the Montana frontier, cold and gray and without ceremony. The sky pressed low against the hills like a lid on a pot. Silas rode his horse, a big, steady roan named Judge, 12 miles along the valley road into Larkspur Bend, arriving at the station with 30 minutes to spare. The town of Larkspur Bend was not much to speak of. A main street of maybe 8 buildings, a livery stable, a general store run by a man named Gruber, who watered down his molasses and everyone knew it, a saloon that never seemed to close, and a train station that existed primarily because the Northern Pacific Line had needed somewhere to stop between 2 larger somewheres. Silas tied Judge at the post outside the station and went inside to wait. A few other people stood on the platform. A young couple meeting family from the east, a feed merchant waiting on supplies, the station master Holt who had worked this platform for 11 years and had the look of a man who had seen everything twice and stopped being surprised about any of it. Boone, said Holt by way of greeting. Holt, said Silas. They stood in silence. That was sufficient. The train came in at 3:20. sliding into the station with that great mechanical exhale of steam and iron, and the platform suddenly filled with noise and movement. The young couple pressed forward. The feed merchant moved toward the freight car. Passengers descended the iron steps. A traveling salesman with 2 cases, a family of 4 with a baby that had been crying for the last 40 miles by the look of the mother's face, a man in a city suit who looked immediately uncomfortable in the cold air. Several others. Silas stood apart from all of it, arms crossed, watching the steps. He was looking for a woman. He didn't know what she looked like. The telegram had said nothing useful. Widow, age 52, decent. That was all he had to work with. He found himself scanning faces with a reluctant attention he hadn't intended to bring, checking each woman who descended, dismissing each one, too young, not traveling alone, already being greeted. The platform crowd began to thin. The station master called out a departure warning. The conductor made his rounds. The engine exhaled again, a long hiss of steam like the breath of something enormous and indifferent. And then Silas saw her. She came down the iron steps last, or nearly last, moving carefully, not timidly, but with the deliberate care of a person who has learned not to rush, who has learned that hurrying doesn't change outcomes. She carried a single suitcase in her right hand, the leather worn soft with age, the clasps tarnished to a dull brass. She wore a dark traveling dress, practical, clean, but not new, and a wool coat that had been good quality once and was still presentable if you didn't look too closely at the cuffs. Her hair was gray-brown, pinned neatly at the back of her head. Her face was, Silas found himself noticing before he'd meant to, neither plain nor striking, but strong. The kind of face that had lived in it. High cheekbones, clear eyes that moved steadily across the platform without hurry or anxiety. A set to her jaw that reminded him, with an uncomfortable jolt, of someone who had already decided not to be afraid. She stepped onto the platform. She looked around once, twice. No one moved toward her. Silas stayed where he was. The train let out its final warning. Doors closed along its length with a series of metallic sounds. The couple had already disappeared with their relations. The feed merchant was overseeing the unloading of his order. The other passengers had moved toward town or toward waiting wagons. The woman with the worn suitcase stood alone on the platform. The train began to move. He should have walked to her right then. He knew that. But something locked in his chest. Not cruelty, not indifference, but something older and more complicated. The particular paralysis of a man who has been alone so long that proximity to another person feels like standing at the edge of something with no bottom. He watched her instead. He watched her watch the train pull away. She didn't chase it, didn't call out, just stood and watched it go. And there was something in the steadiness of her posture that struck him harder than he'd expected. She wasn't devastated. She wasn't performing calm either. She was simply present with what was happening to her, standing straight on a cold platform in a town she didn't know, holding a suitcase that contained what appeared to be the sum total of her portable life. The platform cleared around her until it was just the two of them and old Holt at the far end, shuffling papers. The wind came down off the hills then, the particular October wind of eastern Montana that doesn't build gradually, but arrives all at once with its full intent, carrying grit and the smell of distant snow. The woman pulled her coat tighter across her chest with her free hand and did not move. Silas uncrossed his arms. He told himself he was only going to tell her, explain clearly, without rudeness, that there had been a misunderstanding, that his sister had acted without his knowledge, that arrangements would be made to return her to Billings. He would be direct. He would be respectful. He would not make it harder than it needed to be. He crossed the platform. She turned before he reached her. Those clear eyes found him immediately, and he understood at once that she was not a woman who was easily caught off guard. "You're Silas Boone," she said. It wasn't a question. "Yes, ma'am." "I thought so. You have the look of a man who rode a long way to say something difficult." He stopped a few feet from her. Up close he could see that she was cold, the faint tension at her jaw, the slight redness across her cheekbones, but her voice was even, unhurried. "Mrs. Whitlock," he said. Miss Whitlock is fine. Or Margaret. Either suits me." "Margaret." He took off his hat without thinking about it, which he immediately regretted as a signal of deference he hadn't meant to send. "I want to be honest with you." "Please," she said simply. "My sister sent that telegram without my knowledge or consent. I don't know what she told you or what arrangement she described, but I had no part in making it. I came here today to—" He paused. The words that had ridden easily in his head all the way from the ranch felt different now, standing in front of her. "To tell you that directly, and to help arrange your return to Billings." A silence fell between them, brief but full. Margaret Whitlock looked at him for a long moment. Not with anger, not with hurt, though perhaps there was the smallest shadow of something behind her eyes that he might have called resignation if he'd had to name it. She glanced down the track where the train had gone. Then she looked back at him. "The next train to Billings," she said, "leaves Monday morning." He hadn't known that. He felt suddenly stupid. "I see," he said. "I was told there was work." She said it matter-of-factly, without accusation. "I was told I'd be useful. I was told a ranch needed managing, and I was capable of managing it." She shifted the suitcase to her other hand. "Whether or not there is a personal arrangement is a separate matter. I am not here to force anything on anyone, Mr. Boone. I have never in my life forced anything on anyone." She looked out at the empty platform, at the gray sky, at the town of Larkspur Bend, which was doing nothing to welcome her. Then she looked back at him. "But I will tell you honestly," she said, "that I have $15 to my name, a return ticket I cannot afford to exchange, and nowhere in Billings to go back to. I gave up my room there when I came. I had nothing to give up. It was a boarding house, and it wasn't pleasant, and I will not pretend otherwise." She lifted her chin slightly, not in pride exactly, but in the quiet dignity of someone telling a hard truth without flinching. "I am not asking for charity. I am not asking for anything you are not willing to give. If you send me away, I'll find a way to manage Monday morning. I've managed worse than a cold weekend." The wind moved across the platform again. A piece of paper, some station receipt, skittered across the boards and disappeared. Silas Boone stood holding his hat in both hands, looking at a 52-year-old woman who had traveled a day and a half on a train with a worn suitcase and $15 and nowhere to go, and who was standing in front of him in the cold without self-pity, without performance, without anything other than a plain-spoken account of her circumstances, and a spine that he suspected was made of something considerably stronger than most things he'd encountered in 47 years of living. He put his hat back on. "The ranch is 12 miles, he said. She waited. "It's a hard ride in this wind." He looked at the sky. "Could snow before we get there." "I'm not afraid of snow," she said. He looked at her. She looked back at him. "The house is—" He stopped. He didn't know how to describe it. A man's house, functional, lacking. The kind of house that hadn't been properly tended in 5 years. "It's not what a woman might expect." "Mr. Boone," Margaret said, and for the first time something shifted very slightly at the corner of her mouth. Not quite a smile, but its cousin. "I have no expectations. I gave those up some years ago. I promise you they won't be a problem." They rode out from Larkspur Bend as the afternoon light began to fail. Margaret perched behind Silas on Judge's broad back, her suitcase tied across the saddle horn, neither of them speaking very much. The valley road stretched out between hills that rolled away into the distance, the pale grass bent and rushing with the wind, the sky above them the particular pewter color of late October in Montana that always feels like a held breath before something inevitable. Silas kept his eyes on the road and tried to account for what had just happened. He had come to send her away. He had somehow brought her home. He wasn't entirely sure at what moment the plan had changed, and he found that the uncertainty bothered him less than it should have. Behind him, Margaret held the back of the saddle and watched the country go by and said nothing, which he found he appreciated more than he had any right to. About 6 miles out, she said, "The fences along the south ridge there." "What about them?" "Third post from the old pine. It's leaning. Another hard winter, and it'll go down." He looked where she indicated. She was right. He'd been meaning to get to that section for a month. "I see it," he said. "Just noting." Silence again. A half-mile further, she said, "How many head?" 43 cattle, 14 sheep, 2 horses besides Judge." "Sheep and cattle together?" "My wife's idea originally. She believed in the diversification." A pause. "She was right," Margaret said. "Not perfunctory, not performative, just a simple, considered verdict." "Yes," Silas said. "She usually was." The road curved up through a cut in the hills, and the ranch came into view below them. The main house, the barn, the outbuildings, the creek glinting silver in the failing light, the fields that had once been green and ordered and full, and were now, in late October, stripped down to their honest bones. Still good land, still sound, but wearing its struggle plainly. He felt the familiar mix of pride and grief that he always felt looking at this place. Pride, because he'd built it. Grief, because he could see clearly what it was becoming without enough hands, enough money, enough time. He wondered, briefly, unwillingly, what she saw when she looked at it. "How long have you been working it alone?" she asked. 5 years, he said. Another silence. "That explains the fences," she said. He turned his head slightly, unsure if he should be offended, but she wasn't mocking him. Her voice carried no edge. Just observation, clear and practical, the way you'd state a fact about the weather. "Yes," he said finally. "I suppose it does." The house was exactly what he'd feared it would look like through someone else's eyes. He'd cleaned the main room that morning out of some stubborn pride he'd been trying to ignore, but the cleaning of a man who has been alone for 5 years cannot entirely erase the evidence of 5 years of solitude. The kitchen table held a stack of account ledgers that had never been properly organized. The curtains on the east window were faded to near translucence. The bookshelves were functional but cheerless. The stone fireplace, at least, was good, solid, well-built, and he had a fire laid before she'd finished looking around. He brought in her suitcase. She set it by the door without opening it and looked around the room the same way she'd looked at the fences, steadily, systematically, taking inventory. "The spare room is through there," he said, nodding toward the door at the back. "It's small, but it has a good window and the chimney runs through the wall so it stays warm enough." "That's fine," she said. He stopped. He had no idea how to navigate this. He had a woman in his house for the first time in 5 years. The normal protocols of hosting had rusted out of him entirely. "I'll make coffee," he said finally, because it was the most practical thing he could think of. "I'll make it," she said, and moved to the kitchen with the ease of someone walking into a room they've decided to understand. He stood near the fire and watched her orient herself, opening the cabinet where he kept the coffee, finding the pot, locating the water bucket, noting with a slight tilt of her head that it was nearly empty, and then turning to look at him with an expression that was entirely without judgment, but very clearly a question. "Well," he said, and went to fill the bucket. They ate dinner that night. She had found salt pork and dried beans in the stores, assessed the state of the pantry with an expression of focused attention while the beans soaked, and produced by 8 o'clock a meal that was simple, but better seasoned than anything Silas had eaten in recent memory. She set the table with a natural efficiency that was somehow not intrusive, found his 2 good plates without being told where they were, and sat across from him in a way that suggested she was very deliberately not making this strange. He tried to do the same. "The account books," she said, nodding toward the stack on the table's edge. "May I look at them?" "They're not in good order." "I know, I could see that from across the room." No apology in her voice, no softening, just fact. "May I look at them?" "If you want," he said. She pulled the top ledger toward her and opened it while she ate, running one finger down the columns with the focused attention of someone reading a language they are fluent in. Her brow furrowed in a few places. She didn't say anything. After a while, she looked up. "Your feed costs are eating you alive," she said. "I know. And you're paying Gruber's store prices for supplies you could get cheaper from the Halverson outfit out of Great Falls if you ordered in larger quantity." Silas set down his fork. "How do you know about the Halverson outfit?" "'Cause I spent 11 years managing the accounts for my late husband's farm in Nebraska," she said. "And 3 years before that managing the household accounts for a family in St. Louis. I know supply merchants." She closed the ledger. "I know what things cost and where the money goes. I'm good at it." She said this the way someone states a skill, not boastfully, not shyly, but with the plain confidence of a person who has earned their competence honestly and sees no reason to hide it. He looked at her across the table. "My sister," he said slowly, "told me she'd found a woman to help manage the ranch." "Yes, I thought that was," he paused, "persuasive language." "You thought she meant a wife," Margaret said, "to cook and clean and be companionable." "More or less. She may have meant that too." Margaret folded her hands on the table. "I can do those things." But I'm also telling you that I know accounts, I know supply chains, I know livestock management, I know how to read a land record and a water right and a county deed. I am not just a companion, Mr. Boone. I am, or I can be, considerably more useful than that. The fire crackled. Outside, the wind worked at the corners of the house. Silas Boone looked at this woman he had ridden 12 miles to send away, who was sitting across his table eating his beans and reading his ledgers and telling him with perfect calm exactly what she was capable of. He thought of the leaning fence post, of the disorganized accounts, of the feed costs, of the long, hollowed-out winters with only the sound of the wind for company. The arrangement, he said carefully, would be whatever you're comfortable with, she said immediately. I am not here to press a claim. I am here because your sister told me there was need, and I have skill to offer, and I need a place to be useful. That's all it has to be, if that's all it can be. He nodded slowly. She looked at him with those clear, steady eyes that had looked at a departing train and a cold platform and a strange man's face without flinching, and he understood, with the particular clarity that comes sometimes without warning, that this was not a fragile woman looking for rescue. This was not a desperate woman looking for shelter in the soft sense of the word. This was someone who had been through the long discipline of loss and come out the other side still standing, still sharp, still, and this was the word that surprised him when it arrived, still whole. I'll show you the water situation tomorrow, he said, and the barn roof has a problem on the northeast corner. I'll look at it, she said. And the accounts? I'll have a clearer picture by the end of the week. He nodded again. The spare room, he said, has a good latch on the door. She met his eyes. Something passed between them. Not warmth exactly, not yet, but something more like the recognition of mutual respect between two people who have both been alone long enough to understand what it means to be careful with trust. Thank you, she said. And she meant it simply, without sentiment, which meant more than sentiment would have. That night, Silas lay in his bed and listened to the wind and thought about what he had done. He had come to send her away. He had brought her home. He told himself it was practical. The ranch needed help. She had skills. It was a transaction, a working arrangement, nothing more and nothing less. He told himself this with some conviction, but in the quiet of the house, in the particular quality of the dark, he was aware of something he hadn't felt in a very long time. The house had a different sound to it. Not because she was loud. She wasn't. He'd heard the soft sound of the latch on the spare room door, the quiet of her settling. Nothing more. But the house sounded different anyway. The way a room sounds different when it is no longer empty, some acoustic property of presence that has nothing to do with volume. He put one arm behind his head and looked at the ceiling. Clara, he thought, I don't know what this is. He didn't have an answer for that. He suspected answers would take considerably longer to arrive than one night. Outside, the first fine grains of snow began to tap against the window glass. Light, tentative, the advance scouts of a Montana winter that was coming whether anyone was ready for it or not. Inside Boone Ranch, for the first time in 5 years, two people slept under the same roof. Neither of them knew yet what that would mean. But the ranch, and the autumn, and the long Montana winter ahead of them were all already in motion, already unfolding, and there was nothing left to do now but meet them. The abandoned widow, who arrived with a worn suitcase and nowhere to go, had taken her first step into a life that was still, against all odds, being written. And Silas Boone, who had ridden out that morning to refuse the future, had brought it home. Snow came to the valley on the third day. Not the polite, decorative kind that settles softly on fence posts and makes the world look like something out of a Christmas illustration. This was Montana snow, purposeful, horizontal, driven by a wind that found every gap in every wall and reminded you exactly how thin the line was between a warm house and a killing cold. It arrived before dawn, and it meant business. And by the time Silas pulled on his boots in the gray half-light of morning, 6 inches had already buried the yard and more was coming. He expected to find the kitchen empty. He expected, in some half-conscious way, to discover that the previous day had been some kind of aberration, that he would walk out and the spare room door would be open and the suitcase would be gone, and he would stand alone in his kitchen the way he had stood alone in his kitchen for 5 years, making his own coffee and eating his own beans and conducting his life in the quiet, functional misery of a man who has forgotten that misery is optional. Instead, he smelled coffee before he reached the kitchen door. Margaret was already up, already dressed, standing at the stove with a cast-iron skillet going and his account ledgers spread open on the kitchen table, weighted flat at the corners by a coffee cup and a small river stone she had apparently found on the windowsill. She had her reading spectacles on, wire-rimmed, slightly bent at one earpiece, and she was writing in the margin of one of the ledgers in a small, precise hand, while something that smelled considerably better than anything Silas had produced in recent memory sizzled in the pan. She looked up when he came in. "There's coffee," she said, "and I found cornmeal in the back of the pantry. It's not expired despite its best efforts." He sat down at the table. She poured him coffee without being asked and returned to the stove, and he sat for a moment in the strange experience of being in his own kitchen and feeling, for the first time in years, like a guest in the best possible sense, like someone whose presence had been accounted for, expected, prepared for. "You're up early," he said. "I'm always up early, old habit." She turned the cornbread, she'd made it in rounds, the old way, in the skillet directly. "Also, I couldn't sleep, the wind. It does that when it's building to something." "I noticed." She slid the rounds onto a plate and brought it to the table, then sat across from him with her own coffee and pulled the ledger back toward her. "I've been through 3 years of accounts." "Already? I read fast." She tapped a column with her pencil. "Your biggest problem isn't the feed costs. I was wrong about that last night, or rather, it's not the biggest problem. Your biggest problem is that you haven't collected on 2 outstanding debts from neighboring ranches. A Holt family on the North Ridge owes you for shared fence repair. A man named Alderman owes you for 2 seasons of water easement." Silas wrapped both hands around his coffee cup. "Alderman's had a hard run." "I understand that," she said without softness, but also without cruelty. "But so have you. You can't run charity from a position of scarcity. Collect what you're owed and then decide how generous you want to be with what's yours." He looked at her over his cup. She was looking at the ledger, pencil moving. "You're direct," he said. "I am," she agreed, not looking up. "I've found it saves a great deal of time." Outside, the snow built against the walls and the wind worked at the eaves, and Silas Boone sat at his kitchen table in the unexpected company of a woman who had reorganized his understanding of his own finances before he'd finished his first cup of coffee, and he didn't entirely know what to do with that. So he did what seemed most sensible. He ate the cornbread, which was excellent, and he let her work. The snow kept them mostly inside that first day. Silas went out twice to check the livestock. The cattle were crowded against the south wall of the barn where he'd built a windbreak 2 years ago. The sheep huddled in their pen, miserable and woolly and fine. Both times he returned to find Margaret either in the account books or moving through the house with that quiet, systematic attention she brought to everything, opening cabinets and assessing contents, running a hand along a shelf with the expression of someone taking a census. She wasn't cleaning exactly, or rather, she wasn't cleaning the way a woman performs cleaning to demonstrate diligence. She was auditing the house the way she'd audited the ledgers, gathering information, building a picture. On his second return from the barn, stamping snow off his boots at the door, he found her standing in front of the pantry shelves with a small notebook, writing. "The flour situation's manageable," she said without turning around. "The salt situation is not. And you're nearly out of lamp oil. If we get a sustained storm—" "I know about the oil," he said. "Do you have more in the outbuilding?" "1 tin. That's 2 weeks if we're careful. We should get to town before the next front comes through." "The next front won't come for—" He stopped, looked at the sky through the window. 3 days, maybe 4. "Then we have time." She closed the notebook. "I made a supply list. Do you have an account at Gruber's store?" "I do." "I'd like to look at what you've been paying before we go. I want to know which items we can source differently." She turned to face him. "Do you trust me to negotiate with Gruber?" The question landed with a specificity that startled him. Not can I, but do you trust me to? The difference was not small. "Yes," he said, and found that he meant it. Something moved in her expression, brief, contained, almost immediately gone, but it was there. Satisfaction, perhaps, or something quieter than that. The particular quality of a person who has been doubted for long enough that simple trust feels like something worth noting. "Good," she said, and went back to her notebook. By the end of the first week, certain things had changed at Boone Ranch in ways that were difficult to articulate but impossible to miss. The account ledgers were reorganized and balanced in a new book she'd requested from town. The columns clear and current, the outstanding debts noted and dated. The pantry was restocked, partly from Gruber's store and partly from the Halverson supply catalog she'd sent away for, at prices that made Silas's eyebrows rise when he compared them to what he'd been paying. A loose board on the kitchen floor, the one that had turned a nail upward at a treacherous angle for the better part of 2 years, was fixed with a competence that surprised him until he remembered that she'd managed a farm for 11 years, and farm management includes carpentry, whether you planned for it or not. The spare room's latch was always latched. That hadn't changed. What also hadn't changed? The careful, precise distance they kept from anything personal. They talked about the ranch constantly, about the fence line, the water supply, the livestock, the accounts, the weather, the price of beef, the reliability of the Northern Pacific Line for supply shipments. They talked about practical things with a thoroughness and an ease that, if you didn't think too carefully about it, could almost look like intimacy, could almost sound like two people who had been doing this for years. But they didn't talk about Clara. They didn't talk about Margaret's late husband in Nebraska. They didn't talk about what had brought either of them to this arrangement, or what they expected it to be, or how long it might last. Those topics lived in the spaces between sentences, present, and unaddressed, the way a piece of furniture that's been moved slightly off-center is always visible in peripheral vision, even when you're looking at something else. On a Thursday in early November, Silas came in from mending the south fence, the leaning post Margaret had noticed on their first ride in, which had indeed needed attention, to find her standing at the kitchen window, very still, looking out at the hills with an expression he hadn't seen on her face before. Not the focused, forward attention she brought to work. Something older and quieter, the expression of a person who is somewhere else in their mind while their body stands at a window. He didn't ask. He took off his coat and gloves and started to move past her to the stove. His name was Robert, she said. He stopped. My husband. She didn't turn from the window. 11 years. He was a good farmer, a decent man. A pause. He died of fever. 3 days. That's all it took. 3 days, and he was gone. Silas stood in the middle of his kitchen, coat in his hands. I'm sorry, he said. It was 6 years ago. Another pause. Outside, a hawk tilted across the white sky. I keep expecting the arithmetic to help. 6 years. That's a long time. You'd think the weight would go down proportionally. She turned from the window then, and her face was composed again, or nearly composed, the edges of it still carrying some residue of that other expression, the faraway one. Does it? For you? He was quiet for a moment. No, he said honestly. It doesn't go down. It just changes shape, gets easier to carry, but it doesn't get lighter. She looked at him steadily. That's the most useful thing anyone has said to me about it, she said. Everyone else tells me time heals. Time doesn't heal, he said. You just get stronger. Something shifted between them in that moment. Small, precise, like the click of a mechanism finding its alignment. Not dramatic, not announced, just a door that had been very slightly ajar opening another inch. She turned back to the stove. He hung up his coat. They didn't speak of it again that day, but the room was different afterward, some increment warmer against the cold outside, and they both knew it, even if neither of them would have said so. November deepened into something serious. The storms came in waves, 2 and 3 days at a stretch, and the temperature dropped to places that made the livestock miserable and the work brutal. Silas was out in it constantly, checking the herd, reinforcing the windbreak, hauling feed through snow that came to his knees in the low spots. His hands cracked in the cold. His back, which had given him trouble since a fence post incident 3 years prior, made its opinion of the conditions very clearly known. Margaret, who could have reasonably stayed inside managing the books in the household, did not stay inside. She appeared in the barn on the second morning of the worst November storm, wearing a man's wool coat she'd found hanging in the back room, enormous on her, swallowing her shoulders entirely, and carrying a feed bucket with both hands against the weight of it. Silas, who was trying to get the cattle settled with insufficient sleep and a back that was announcing its grievances in detail, looked up to find her there. You don't have to, he started. Which ones are lagging, she said. I can see 3 that look off. Which do you want me to watch? He stared at her for a moment. She looked back with that clear, patient expression, waiting. The brown one at the end, he said. She's been off her feed since yesterday. I'll stay with her. She moved toward the animal without drama, set her bucket down, and began the slow, careful work of attending to a reluctant cow in a cold barn with the unhurried competence of someone who has done this before, many times, in many cold barns. He went back to work. She stayed with the struggling cow for 4 hours in that freezing barn, her breath visible in the air, the enormous coat ridiculous and completely irrelevant. The cow pulled through. That was the day the dynamic between them changed in a way that was deeper than conversation or account books. Silas had been in the company of many capable people in his life. His father had been capable. Clara had been capable. Brilliantly, quietly, in ways that he'd spent 5 years cataloging in memory with the specific gratitude of a man who only fully understood what he'd had after it was gone. He'd known capable ranch hands and capable neighbors and capable men of business. Capability, in his experience, was common enough. What was not common, what he had, if he was honest, perhaps only seen once before in his life, and that in Clara, was this particular quality that Margaret had, which was the quality of competence that asks nothing in return. Not recognition, not appreciation, not credit. She did what needed doing because it needed doing, and she did it well. And then she went on to the next thing that needed doing, and the fact of her competence was simply a fact, like the fact of the cold or the fact of the snow, requiring no acknowledgement to be real. He started to watch for it, started to notice the specific ways she moved through the ranch. Efficient, observant, never idle, never performative. She noticed things he'd stopped seeing, the way the water trough in the east field iced over faster than the others because of a break in the windbreak. The fact that 2 of his sheep were developing foot rot and needed attention before it spread. The precise moment, one gray afternoon, when the temperature dropped fast enough that they needed to bring the youngest calves into the barn, and she came to the door and said, "Now," with a quiet certainty, and she was right. 40 minutes later, it was 15 degrees colder, and the calves who would have suffered in it were safe and warm. "How did you know?" he asked that evening, genuinely curious. She was sewing a split in one of his work gloves by lamplight, a task he hadn't asked her to do and hadn't expected. She looked up. The sky had a particular color at the western edge. Robert taught me that. He said his grandfather taught him. She returned to the sewing. Weather keeps patterns if you learn to read them. My father said the same thing. Most men who work the land learn it eventually. She tied off the thread, snipped it, handed him the glove. Some of them teach their wives, some don't. Clara learned it herself, he said. She had a gift for it. It was the first time he'd said Clara's name in Margaret's presence. He hadn't planned to. It arrived the way true things sometimes do, without announcement. Margaret looked at him. Her expression was careful and kind. She sounds like someone worth knowing, she said. She was, he said. She was exactly that. The town of Larkspur Bend began to notice Margaret Whitlock sometime in late November, and its opinion formed with the speed and confidence of a small community that has limited entertainment and unlimited interest in its neighbors' affairs. The first time Margaret rode in with Silas to the general store, Gruber himself watched her from behind his counter with the expression of a man calculating something. She moved through his store with the focused attention she brought to everything, reading prices, comparing quantities, asking precise questions about the sourcing of his flour and the freshness of his salt pork. And when she was finished, she placed an order that was 40% smaller than Silas's usual order because she had already arranged the bulk of it through Halverson's at better prices. And she told Gruber this pleasantly and without apology, and Gruber's expression shifted from calculating to something more complicated. Outside, 2 women from the Methodist congregation, Mrs. Paulson and a younger woman named Beth Alderman, wife of the rancher who owed Silas money for the water easement, watched them load the wagon. "She's older than I expected," Beth Alderman said. Said Mrs. Paulson. "She came on the train as a mail-order bride, you know, at her age." A pause, rich with implication. "It's a little sad, isn't it?" "Is it?" said Mrs. Paulson, who was watching Margaret lift a 50-pound sack of feed into the wagon bed with practiced efficiency, the kind of lift that requires technique, not youth. Well, she's certainly not. I mean, she's not a young woman, and poor Silas already had one good wife. You'd think— Beth, said Mrs. Paulson, go home and tend to your husband's debts. Beth Alderman went red and said nothing more. But the whispers had started, and in Larkspur Bend, whispers moved faster than weather. Too old, too plain, too late in life to start over, to be useful, to be anything other than a burden dressed up as a solution. These were the things people said in the comfortable privacy of their own certainties, in the places where small minds conduct their small judgments and call it community. Margaret heard some of it. She was not oblivious. On their second trip into town, she overheard two men outside the saloon make a comment about Silas's mail order arrangement that was meant to be funny and was neither. She heard it, noted it, gave no visible reaction, and continued into the store. On the way home, somewhere in the middle of the valley road, she said, "People talk." "Always have," Silas said. "Does it bother you?" He considered. "Used to. Less now." He looked at the road. "You?" "I decided a long time ago," she said evenly, "that I would not spend my life being smaller than I am because other people are uncomfortable with my size." A pause. "Metaphorically speaking." Despite everything, Silas almost smiled. "That sounds like something worth deciding. I recommend it." The wagon moved on through the cold air. The hills rolled away on both sides, vast and indifferent to the opinions of Larkspur Bend. December brought the kind of cold that settles into the valley like something that intends to stay permanently, and with it came the true test of what Boone Ranch was made of. The storm that arrived on the 14th of December was the kind of storm that gets named in a community's memory, not after a person, but after itself, referred to for years simply as that December storm, the way certain winters earn their own gravity. It came in from the northwest with 3 days' warning in the cloud formations, which Margaret read correctly and Silas confirmed, and they spent those 3 days in a state of focused, practical preparation that had its own rhythm to it now, its own language of divided tasks and wordless coordination. She managed the food stores, the water supply, the lamp oil, the firewood inside the house. He secured the barn, the livestock, the outer buildings, the fences most vulnerable to drifting. They moved around each other in the cramped space of the ranch, with the unconscious efficiency of two people who have learned each other's movements, who can navigate the same doorway without collision, who know without asking which side of the table the other one wants, who have developed the small shared grammar of daily life that looks like nothing from the outside and is, in fact, everything. The storm hit on the 17th and did not relent for 4 days. On the second night, at 3 a.m, with wind shaking the walls and temperature outside that Silas measured at 30 below by the yard thermometer, he heard Margaret's voice through the house. "Silas!" He was out of bed before he was fully awake, which told him something about the state of his attention to her. He found her at the front window. In the dark outside, barely visible through the driving snow, something was moving in the yard. "3 cattle are out," she said. "The east gate. The latch didn't hold." He was already pulling on his coat. "Stay inside." "I will not," she said, pulling on her coat over her nightclothes with the calm efficiency of someone who has already decided. And he looked at her in the lamplight and understood that arguing this point would cost time he didn't have. "Stay close," he said. They went out together into the howling dark. What followed was 90 minutes of the hardest physical work Silas had done in years. Herding panicked cattle through driving snow in 30 below darkness, moving on instinct and memory and the sound of each other's voices cutting through the wind. He lost track of her twice, and both times found her again by following the sound of her. Not calling out, not panicking, but making a low, steady sound to the cattle. A working sound, a sound that said, "I know what I'm doing and you can trust that." And the cattle, who are not stupid animals despite appearances, were calming to it. They got all 3 back in. They fixed the gate in the dark with numb hands and a piece of wire Margaret found in her coat pocket. She had, apparently, taken to carrying useful things in her pockets, which he was beginning to understand was simply how she moved through the world. When they got back inside, both of them crusted with snow and shaking with cold, Silas built the fire back up while Margaret put water on for something hot, and they sat at the kitchen table in the late hours of that violent night, thawing their hands around cups of hot water with dried apple in it, because they were both too tired to make anything more complex. Her hair had come down from its pins in the effort. She hadn't repinned it, It was loose around her shoulders, gray-brown and somewhat wild from the wind, and she was looking at the fire with the expression of exhaustion that goes deep enough to be peaceful. He looked at her in the firelight. He looked away. "Thank you," he said quietly. She turned. "For what?" "For coming out there. You didn't—" "Of course I did," she said simply. "They're your cattle. Your cattle. Not ours." She was careful with that line still. She drew it precisely. But she'd gone out into 30 below darkness at 3 in the morning for them, careful lines or not. "They're doing well," he said. "The ranch, better than they were." She looked at the fire again. "The accounts will be stable by spring if the prices hold." "Not just the accounts," he said. She was quiet for a moment. "It's a good ranch," she said finally. "It was already a good ranch. It just needed—" She stopped. "What?" he said. She seemed to consider. "Someone to remind it of what it was," she said. The fire popped and settled. Outside, the storm continued its blind, indifferent work. Inside, in the small, warm circle of the kitchen lamplight, something quietly continued that neither of them had named yet, and perhaps did not need to name, because some things grow better in the unnamed spaces, in the dark and the cold, and the unremarkable dailiness of two people learning the shape of each other's presence. Margaret pinned her hair back up. He stoked the fire. They went back to their separate rooms. But the night had changed something, the way the right kind of cold changes metal, not breaking it, but settling it into a new configuration that holds better than the old one ever did. The storm broke 3 days later. The valley was white and still and blinding in the first clean sunlight, and Boone Ranch stood intact, its cattle accounted for, its stores sufficient, its fences holding, its account books balanced and clear on the kitchen table inside. And the woman the town of Larkspur Bend had dismissed as too old, too plain, too late in life to matter. She stood on the porch in the first good light, looking out at the fields with her arms crossed and her breath making small clouds in the cold air. And there was something in her posture that was neither pride nor relief, but some combination of the two that has no single word, the particular satisfaction of someone who went through the fire and came out the other side, still standing. Silas came to stand beside her on the porch. They looked out at the white, quiet valley together. "Spring," he said. "What about it?" "It'll come." She glanced at him sideways. Something moved at the corner of her mouth. "It always does," she said. They stood there a while longer, not speaking, while the winter sun climbed slowly over the hills and the snow glittered on the fields below them, and the creek at the valley's edge caught the light and threw it back, bright and cold and entirely alive. Spring arrived in the valley the way it always did in Montana. Not gently, not all at once, but in negotiations. A few warm days conceded by the cold before another frost reasserted itself, back and forth until finally the cold simply exhausted itself and surrendered. The snow pulled back from the fields in slow retreat. The creek rose with snowmelt, running fast and loud and copper-bright in the morning light, and the cattle moved out onto the new grass with the particular relief of animals who have survived something and know it. Boone Ranch came out of winter in better shape than it had gone in. This was not an accident, and everyone on the property knew it, though only one of them would have said so plainly. The accounts were sound. The livestock losses over winter had been 3 sheep and 1 calf, low, given the severity of the December storm. The pantry had been managed so precisely that they'd ended February with a small surplus rather than the usual deficit. 2 of the fence lines that had been failing when Margaret arrived were repaired. The barn roof's northeast corner, which Silas had been ignoring with the particular procrastination of a man who has too many problems and insufficient resources to address all of them, had been patched in January during a brief warm spell when Margaret had appeared with tar and timber and a purposeful look that left no room for discussion. The town of Larkspur Bend had not exactly apologized for its winter whispers, because small towns rarely do, but the quality of its attention had changed. When Margaret came into Gruber's store now, the conversation did not stop so much as recalibrate. People watched her differently, with the guarded respect that communities extend to those who have demonstrated competence in ways that are difficult to dismiss. Gruber himself, who had initially regarded her renegotiation of Silas's supply costs with the resentment of a man losing margin, had come around to a grudging acknowledgement that she was a good customer in the ways that mattered. She paid on time, she knew what she wanted, and she did not waste his time or her own. Beth Alderman, whose husband had finally settled the water easement debt in February, after Margaret had sent a letter so politely and precisely worded that refusal became socially impossible, still did not speak warmly to Margaret in public. But she no longer said things in public either, which was its own form of progress. It was on a morning in the second week of April, with the creek running full and the fields greening in the particular vivid way of spring on the Montana frontier, that Silas first heard the name Garrett Holloway. He was at the fence line on the west boundary of the property, checking the posts after the snow melt, when his neighbor, Tom Birch, rode up on a gray mare and stopped with the expression of a man carrying news he is not entirely comfortable delivering. "Silas?" Tom said. "Tom." Silas straightened from the fence post he'd been assessing. "You look like something's sitting on you." Tom Birch was 63 years old, had ranched this valley for 30 of those years, and had the weathered, careful look of a man who chose his words with the deliberation of someone who has seen what careless ones cost. He shifted in his saddle. "You know the Holloway outfit," he said. It was not a question. "I know of it," Silas said carefully. Everyone in the county knew of Garrett Holloway the way you know of a weather system forming at the edge of the horizon. Not directly experienced yet, but felt in the pressure of the air. Holloway ran the largest cattle operation in the region, headquartered 60 miles north, and had spent the better part of a decade acquiring land, water rights, and county influence with the systematic patience of a man who understands that empires are built by accumulation. "He's been buying up the ridge properties on the north end of the valley," Tom said. "3 of them, last fall and winter, paid over market, and the sellers took it because he's Holloway, and you take what Holloway offers." Silas looked at the creek, visible in the middle distance, catching the spring sunlight. "What does that have to do with me?" Tom was quiet for a moment. "Those ridge properties, 2 of them have sections that border your upper creek land. The water that feeds your creek comes down through those sections." Silas went very still. "He's filed a claim," Tom said. "I heard it from the county recorder's clerk, who is a friend of my wife. Filed it last month, quiet as you like. Claims his ridge properties give him prior right to the creek water by upstream position. He's not claiming your land, he's claiming the water. If it holds—" Tom stopped. "If it holds, Silas, you're looking at a dry creek by summer. Without that water, your cattle won't survive the season." The morning was bright and cold, and the creek ran loud in the distance, and Silas stood at his fence line and felt the ground shift under him in the way it does when something you have built your life on turns uncertain. "Who's his man in the county?" Silas asked. "Sheriff Crane is friendly to him. Commissioner Hatch took his money in the last election, which is an open secret." Tom met his eyes. "He's been careful about this, Silas, careful and patient, and he has lawyers." Silas looked at the creek for a long moment. "I need to get home," he said. He told Margaret that evening. He laid it out plainly, the way he had learned she preferred. Facts first, implications second, no softening that would require her to ask him to unsoften it. He watched her face as he talked. She listened with the absolute stillness she brought to important things, elbows on the kitchen table, hands folded, eyes on him. When he finished, she said nothing for a moment. Then, "How long has your family held this land?" "My father settled it in 1851. I inherited it in 1869. "And the creek?" "It's been Boone water as long as the ranch has existed. There's never been a dispute." "That you know of," she said carefully. He looked at her. "What does that mean?" "It means that Holloway's lawyers will have done their research before he filed. He didn't file blind. He filed because he found something, or believes he found something, that gives his claim legal color." She was quiet for a moment, her eyes moving to some middle distance where she was clearly working through something. "He'll claim prior appropriation based on upstream position. He'll argue that his ridge properties, by virtue of their elevation relative to your land, establish a natural first right. Can he win that argument?" "It depends on the documentation." She looked at him directly. "Silas, do you have your father's original land grant, the full documentation when he settled this property?" "I have papers," he said, "in the back room. I haven't looked at them in—" He thought about it. "Honestly, I don't know when I last looked at them." She was already rising from the table. He led her to the back room, a small space he used primarily for storage. for the overflow of ranch records and the detritus of decades of rural life accumulated in boxes and tins and wrapped paper bundles. She stood in the doorway and surveyed it with an expression that mixed dismay and determination in proportions that were difficult to parse. "I need everything," she said. "Every piece of paper that relates to land or water or this property's boundaries, every record your father left, every document you've received from the county." She looked at him. "How long will it take us to go through this?" "I don't know. Days, maybe." "Then we start tonight," she said, and walked into the room. They started that night, and they did not stop for 4 days. It was the most concentrated period of shared work they had done, and it had a quality different from the winter labor, different from mending fences or hauling feed or herding cattle through storms. This was quieter and, in its own way, more demanding. The careful, focused excavation of a family's documented history, the slow assembly of a legal picture from materials that had never been organized with any legal intention. Margaret worked through documents with a precision that Silas found almost unsettling to watch. She sorted, categorized, read everything, made notes in her small, clear hand, discarded nothing until she had read it and understood its possible relevance. He worked beside her, providing context where she needed it. Dates, names, relationships, the history of particular boundaries and agreements and handshake deals that had governed this valley for 30 years. They fell into a rhythm of working through the daylight hours and part of the evenings, eating at the table surrounded by organized stacks of paper, talking through what they found with the focused economy of people who have no time for anything that isn't essential. On the second day, Margaret found the survey. It was in a tin box at the bottom of a larger crate, wrapped in oilskin that had preserved it with remarkable fidelity. A survey document dated 1853, 2 years after his father had settled the land, conducted by a county surveyor named Frederick Aldous Marsh, and bearing the official stamp of the territorial government. Margaret unwrapped it with careful hands and spread it flat on the table, weighting the corners, and studied it for a long time in silence. Silas watched her read. "Come here," she said. He came around to her side of the table. The survey was hand-drawn with the precise, fine line work of a man who took his profession seriously. It showed the Boone property in its original boundaries, the topography of the surrounding land, the creek in its course from the hills to the south end of the valley, and at the northern edge, where the ridgeline properties now owned by Holloway began. A notation. Margaret put her finger on it. The notation read, in the cramped formal script of 1853 territorial surveying, water source and primary channel of the creek. Herein denominated Boone Creek, established as appurtenant to the Boone land grant in its entirety, upper and lower sections, by original settlement right per Territorial Ordinance 14, Section 7. No subsequent claim of upstream position shall supersede this appurtenant right without formal relinquishment by the original grantee or legal successor. Silas read it twice. "What does appurtenant mean?" he said. "It means attached," Margaret said. Her voice was controlled, but underneath it something was moving. The contained excitement of someone who has been looking for a specific thing and found it in the place least expected. "It means the water right is legally bonded to the land grant itself, not established by usage or position. It was written into the original settlement documentation as a permanent attachment." She looked at him. Holloway's upstream position argument fails completely if this document is valid, because this says position doesn't matter. The water right preceded position. It was established first. "In 1853, Silas said. "In 1853, she confirmed, before anyone owned those ridge properties, before those ridge properties existed as legal parcels." She straightened up. "His lawyers found the gap they thought was there. They didn't find this because they didn't have access to your father's private records." A pause. "He didn't know it existed." Silas looked at the document, at his father's land, at the creek that had run through this property for 30 years of his memory, longer than that in recorded fact, bound to this land by a territorial ordinance written by a surveyor named Marsh, who had done his job thoroughly and well and then been forgotten by history until this moment. "Is it enough?" he said. "I don't know yet." She said it honestly, without false comfort. "I need to find 2 more things. The original land grant with the territorial seal. Does this box have more?" It did. They found it an hour later, and then, near midnight on the 3rd day, in a bundle of papers that had no obvious organizational principle and appeared to have been gathered by his father with the archiving sensibility of a man who saved everything and organized nothing, Margaret found the third document. It was a letter from the Territorial Land Office, dated 1861, responding to an inquiry by a neighboring settler who had apparently questioned the Boone water claim. The land office's response was formal, official, and unambiguous. The Boone water right, as established by the 1853 survey, was registered in the territorial records and constituted an appurtenant right of the highest available category under territorial law. Any challenge would require federal review. Margaret set the letter down on the table. She pressed both hands flat on the surface and looked at it. Then she looked at Silas. "He can't win," she said quietly. "If these documents are presented before the county commission with proper authentication, his claim fails. The legal foundation for his filing doesn't exist." Silas sat very still. The lamp burned low between them. Outside, the spring night was full of the sound of the creek running strong and fast in its course. The water that had always been his, that had always been his father's before him, that a careful man 60 miles north had believed he could take with paperwork and patience and county influence. "He has the sheriff," Silas said. "He has the commissioner. He has political relationships," she said. "That's not the same as having the law. The law," she tapped the documents, "the law is here. These predate his filing by 30 years, by 60 years. Going before the county commission means going public. It means confronting him directly." Silas's voice was measured, but she could hear the weight under it. "Most people around here would tell you that's not a fight a small ranch wins against Garrett Holloway." "Most people around here," Margaret said, "told me I was too old and too plain to be of use to anyone." Silence. He looked at her. "You're saying we do it," he said. "I'm saying the documents give us the right to do it. Whether we do it is your decision." She met his eyes without flinching. "But Silas, if we don't, he takes the water. And without the water, we're finished by July. Everything we've done this winter, all of it. It ends because we were afraid of a man who made his bet on the assumption that no one would look carefully enough to call it." He was quiet for a long time. "We need to take this to someone who can verify the authentication," he said finally. "Someone the commission can't dismiss." "There's a land attorney in Billings," she said. "A man named Carver. I've heard his name mentioned in connection with territorial land disputes. He has a reputation for being honest." She paused. "And for not being in anyone's pocket." Silas nodded slowly. "How soon can we ride?" "I can be ready in an hour," she said. He looked at her. This woman across the table from him in the lamplight, surrounded by the recovered history of his family's claim to this land, who had come with a worn suitcase and nowhere to go and had, in the space of one winter, become the reason this ranch still had a future to fight for. "Margaret," he said. She waited. "I want you to know—" He stopped. There were things working in him that he hadn't yet found the language for. "What you've done here. What you found tonight." "It was in the tin box," she said quietly. "I just looked." "That's not—" He shook his head. "It's not just looking. You knew what to look for. You knew why it mattered. You—" He stopped again. "I wouldn't have known to look for that notation. I wouldn't have understood what it meant if I'd found it." She was quiet for a moment, her hands still flat on the documents. "You would have found a way," she said. "No," he said, simply, without drama. "No, Margaret, I wouldn't have." Something passed across her face in the lamplight, brief and complicated. The expression of a woman who has been told she is valuable by a man who means it, and who does not entirely know how to receive that yet, who has learned, over years of widowhood and displacement, and the particular invisibility of being a woman of a certain age in a world that prefers its women young and uncomplicated, to discount such statements before they can hurt her. But she didn't discount it. She held it for a moment, visibly, and then she looked down at the documents and said, "We should get some sleep. It's a long ride to Billings." They rode for Billings 2 days later, after Margaret had organized the documents with meticulous care, each one wrapped in oilskin, catalogued in a list in her handwriting, carried in a leather satchel borrowed from the ranch's back room. Attorney Carver was a thin, dry man of 60, with the eyes of someone who reads small print for a living and has developed opinions about everything he's read. He received them without ceremony, looked at the documents Margaret had laid before him with the careful attention of a man who knows what he is looking at, and was quiet for a long time. Then he looked up. "Where did you find the 1853 survey?" he asked Margaret directly, which Silas noted, addressed to her as the person who clearly understood the significance of what they'd brought. "In a tin box in the ranch's storage," she said, "in oilskin. The preservation was good." "Good," he said, and turned back to the documents. "Because this," he tapped the Marsh survey with one thin finger. "This is not a common document. The appurtenant notation in 1853 territorial form is a specific legal instrument that was used briefly in the territorial period and then superseded by different statutes in 1871. But its legal standing was never revoked. If it's authenticated, and it will authenticate, this paper and ink are period consistent, it establishes a prior right that Holloway's filing cannot override." "Can you represent us before the county commission?" Silas asked. Carver looked at him. "I can. It won't be without friction. Holloway will send his own attorneys and they will be expensive and aggressive." He paused. "But they'll be arguing against a document that existed before their client was born. That is a difficult argument to make with a straight face before a commission that has to look at its own public record afterward." He looked at the documents again, then at Margaret. "You did good work finding this." "The work was in the looking," she said. "The looking is the work," Carver replied, with the precision of a man who means the distinction. The county commission hearing was set for the 3rd week of May. Garrett Holloway arrived in Larkspur Bend 2 days beforehand with 3 attorneys, a land surveyor of his own engagement, and the particular confidence of a man who has never lost a county proceeding in 10 years of acquiring things that other people owned. He was tall, silver-haired, and carried himself with the ease of someone for whom the world has historically arranged itself helpfully. He was not, by most accounts, a cruel man. He was simply a certain kind of man, the kind who looks at a creek running through someone else's land and sees, first and most vividly, an asset awaiting reallocation. He had heard there would be a contest. His attorneys had briefed him on the opposing claim. He had not heard about the 1853 survey. The commission hearing was held in the county courthouse, a building that smelled of pine resin and old paper, and the accumulated decisions of 30 years of frontier governance. The room was full. Word had moved through the county that a small rancher was challenging Holloway, and that alone was sufficient to bring people in from considerable distances, the way anything unlikely draws a crowd. Silas sat at the table on the left side of the room, with Carver beside him and Margaret to Carver's right, the leather satchel on the table before her. He was aware, without looking, of the room behind them, of Tom Birch somewhere in the rows, of Gruber the storekeeper, of several ranchers he knew by face, if not always by name, of the weight of their various expectations. Some had come hoping, most had come skeptical. Holloway sat at the right table with his 3 attorneys, and when he entered the room his eyes went immediately to the opposing table with the assessment of a man who does this often, gauging the opposition, noting its composition, drawing preliminary conclusions. His gaze moved across Silas, registered Carver with a slight tightening that suggested recognition, and then landed on Margaret. He looked at her for a moment with the particular blankness of a man who cannot quite place why this woman is at this table. Margaret looked back at him with the same clear, unhurried attention she had turned on the departing train at Larkspur Bend Station in October, on the cold platform, in the wind. The expression that had no fear in it and no performance, just presence, steady and absolute. The commission chairman, a heavy man named Foster, who wore his authority like a coat that fit him perfectly, called the proceeding to order. Holloway's lead attorney went first. He was good, precise, confident, fluent in the language of property law and prior appropriation doctrine. He laid out the upstream position argument with the ease of someone who has made it before and won. He cited case precedents. He produced his own survey, commissioned in January, which showed the ridge properties in relation to the creek's source. He was building, brick by careful brick, the structure of a claim that looked solid from the outside. When he sat down, there was a murmur in the room. Then Carver stood. He was not theatrical. He didn't need to be. He simply took the 1853 survey from the satchel. Margaret handed it to him without being asked, precisely timed, and laid it before the commission chairman. "I submit," Carver said, in the dry, unhurried voice of a man with a very good hand, The original survey of the Boone land grant, conducted in 1853 by certified territorial surveyor Frederick Aldous Marsh, bearing the seal of the territorial government. He waited while the chairman examined it. The commission will note the appurtenant notation on the northern boundary section. He then laid the 1861 letter beside it. He then laid the original land grant with its territorial seal beside that. The room was very quiet. Holloway's lead attorney had risen partway from his chair with the expression of a man watching a structure he'd built with considerable care begin to develop cracks. Chairman Foster read the appurtenant notation. He read it again. He passed the documents to the commissioner beside him, who read them with the particular slowness of someone who is reading carefully, because what they are reading matters. Then to the third commissioner, who read them and then looked up at the room with an expression that communicated without requiring words that the situation had changed. Holloway's attorney requested a recess to examine the documents. It was granted. During the recess, Silas sat at the table and did not look at the room and did not speak. Margaret sat beside him with her hands folded and her eyes forward, and once, briefly, she pressed her closed hand against the back of his. A single moment of contact, firm and grounding, and gone before he could respond to it. The recess ended. The documents were authenticated. Carver had brought a paper conservator from Billings who testified to the period consistency of the survey's materials. Holloway's attorneys argued vigorously on 3 grounds, and were answered on 3 grounds. The argument lasted 4 hours. At the end of it, Chairman Foster called the commission to a brief private deliberation. They were out of the room for 22 minutes. When they returned, Foster looked at Holloway's table, and then at Silas's table, and then at the documents before him. "The commission finds," he said, "that the appurtenant water right established by the Boone Land Grant Survey of 1853 and confirmed by the Territorial Land Office correspondence of 1861 constitutes a prior claim of the highest territorial category. The filing by the Holloway interests is denied. The water right of Boone Ranch to the creek in question is confirmed as appurtenant and inviolable." The room behind them erupted. Not all of it. Holloway's people were silent, but the majority of it, the ranchers and the storekeepers and the neighbors who had come skeptical and were leaving differently, broke into the kind of noise that isn't quite cheering, but is the sound of something releasing that had been held under pressure. Silas sat very still for a moment. Beside him, Margaret let out one slow, controlled breath. That was all. No tears, no outburst, just that single breath of release, quiet and complete, the exhalation of someone who has been holding something and can finally set it down. He turned to look at her. She was looking at the commission's table, her jaw set, her eyes bright. Not with triumph exactly, but with the particular light of a person who has done what they came to do and knows it. "Margaret," he said. She turned. He wanted to say something that would be adequate to the moment and understood, looking at her face, that nothing would be. So he said the truest thing he knew. "That tin box," he said. "My father put those documents in that tin box in 1853. He wrapped them in oilskin." He shook his head slowly. "He saved this ranch in 1853, and he didn't know it. And you found it." She held his gaze for a moment. "He saved it," she said quietly. "I just remembered where to look." Across the room, Garrett Holloway was being spoken to in low, urgent tones by his attorneys, and was not listening to any of them. He was looking at the Boone table, at the woman sitting there, with the expression of a man recalibrating an assumption he had held with too much confidence. Outside the courthouse, in the May sunlight, Tom Birch shook Silas's hand for a long time without saying anything, which said everything. Gruber, to Silas's mild astonishment, clapped him on the shoulder. Other men who had doubted, who had whispered, who had been privately certain that Holloway's money would determine the outcome, came forward with the particular complicated grace of people rearranging their understanding of a situation. And more than one of them, making their way to the couple on the courthouse steps, looked past Silas to Margaret, stopped, and said with the awkward sincerity of people who owe an acknowledgement they'd never expected to make, "Ma'am, that was something." She received each one of these with the same quiet steadiness. Later, riding back toward the valley in the long golden light of a May afternoon, the leather satchel across the saddle horn and the creek country spread out below them as they crested the ridge. Silas said nothing for a long time. Then he said, "The town knows now." "Yes," Margaret said. "What you found, what you did." "What the documents proved," she corrected gently. He shook his head. "Don't do that." She glanced at him. "Don't make yourself smaller than you are," he said. "You told me you decided not to do that." A pause, long enough for the horses to carry them another 50 yards down the slope toward home. "You're right," she said, quietly, honestly. "I did decide that." The creek came into view below them, running strong and bright in the afternoon light. The water that had always been theirs, that would remain theirs, catching the sun and throwing it back in long, bright lines across the valley floor. The ranch buildings sat in the middle distance, solid and present, the fields around them green in the spring air. And Silas Boone, who had built this life and nearly lost it, and had it returned to him by the careful hands of a woman the world had written off, looked at it all and felt something settle in his chest. Not the old familiar weight of grief and endurance, but something different. Something that had been accumulating slowly, carefully, all winter long, and had perhaps only now reached the point of being nameable. He didn't name it yet, but it was there. The weeks after the hearing had a particular quality to them, a stillness that wasn't emptiness but something closer to the silence that follows a long storm, when the air is washed clean and the world sits quietly with what remains. The ranch absorbed the spring with the patience of land that has endured worse than a legal challenge and emerged with its fundamental character intact, and Silas moved through his days with the same steadiness he had always brought to work, except that something underneath it had shifted in a way he couldn't entirely account for, and had stopped trying to ignore. The town's attitude had changed in ways both large and small. When Silas and Margaret rode into Larkspur Bend now, the quality of the attention they received was different from anything that had preceded it. Not the whispered dismissal of the winter months, not the skeptical watching of the early spring, but something closer to the frank respect that frontier communities extend to those who have demonstrated, in terms the community understands, that they belong. Tom Birch stopped by the ranch twice in the first week after the hearing, ostensibly to discuss the condition of the shared fence line on the north boundary, but actually, Silas understood, to check on them in the way that men of that era and temperament expressed something they would never call concern. Even Gruber had extended a line of credit without being asked, and Gruber's credit was a thing he extended with all the generosity of a man surrendering a vital organ. Margaret moved through this changed atmosphere the way she moved through everything, steadily, without performance, making no claim on the attention that was now directed at her from quarters that had previously offered only indifference or mild contempt. When Mrs. Paulson stopped her outside the dry goods store one afternoon in late May and said, with the careful directness of a woman who chooses her moments, "Margaret, I'd like to apologize for some things said this winter." Margaret had looked at her for a moment and then said, "Let's begin from here instead." And that had been the end and the beginning of it simultaneously, in the particular efficient way that Margaret handled things she wanted settled and done. But all of this, the changed town, the secured water, the winter that had been endured and the spring that had been won, all of it existed at a slight remove from the central thing that had taken up residence in Silas Boone's chest and was refusing to be managed with the practicality he applied to everything else. He knew what it was. He had known for some time. The knowing and the doing were, as they had been in all the significant moments of his life, separated by a distance that was not geographical but internal. The particular gap between understanding something and having the courage to speak it into the world where it could be accepted or refused. He avoided it with impressive discipline for most of June. He told himself there was too much work. There was always too much work on a ranch in early summer. The cattle needed moving to higher pasture. The hay needed cutting before it went to seed. 2 sections of fence on the east boundary required replacement rather than repair. These were real concerns, genuinely demanding, and he attended to them with the focus of a man who is grateful for the structure that necessity provides. Margaret, for her part, did not press him. She was not a woman who pressed. She went about her own work with the same focused energy she had brought to the ranch since October, and she gave no visible indication that she was aware of the things sitting between them, unnamed and patient, waiting. But she was aware. He knew she was aware the way you know things about people you have lived alongside through a Montana winter. Not because they tell you, but because you have seen them in the unguarded hours, in the 3 in the morning dark, and the lamp-lit late evenings, and the particular vulnerability of exhaustion after hard work. And you have built, through all of that accumulated seeing, a map of the other person that is more detailed and more honest than anything words alone could produce. She knew. She was waiting. And the nature of her waiting, patient, undemanding, giving him room he hadn't asked for and wasn't sure he deserved, was itself a kind of answer to a question he was still trying to find the nerve to ask. It was a Tuesday evening in the 3rd week of June when it happened, which struck Silas afterward as entirely appropriate given his history with Tuesdays. They had been working late on the hay, the two of them and a hired hand named Cully, who came 3 days a week from a family operation down the valley. Cully had gone home at dusk, and they had worked on past it, into the long Montana twilight that lingers at that latitude well past 8 o'clock in summer, both of them in the easy silence they had long since stopped needing to fill, moving through the rhythm of the work until the light finally failed past the point of usefulness. They walked back to the house together, dirty and tired, and Margaret put water on to heat while Silas cleaned up at the yard pump, and by the time he came inside she had put together a cold supper from what was in the pantry. Bread and cured meat and pickled beets and cheese, the pragmatic meal of people too tired to cook properly. And they sat across from each other at the kitchen table the way they had sat across from each other for 8 months now, in the lamplight, in the comfortable silence that had become one of the things Silas found he valued most about the particular life that had developed here. He looked at her. She was eating with the unself-conscious focus of someone genuinely hungry, her hair loose at the back of her neck where the pins had come out during the afternoon's work, a streak of dust on her jaw that she hadn't noticed, and that he decided, in that moment, not to mention. She looked exactly like what she was, a woman who had worked hard all day on land she had come to understand better than she'd expected to, in a life that had not been what she'd planned and was, against considerable odds, genuinely hers. "Margaret," he said. She looked up. He had meant to build toward it, had intended some form of approach that would give the words room to arrive with appropriate context. Instead, they came the way true things sometimes do, without architecture. "I don't want you to leave," he said. She set down her fork. "I don't mean—" He stopped. Tried again. "I mean that I want you to stay. Not as a working arrangement, not as a—" He felt the inadequacy of every word available to him and pressed through it anyway. "I want you to stay because this ranch is not the same place it was in October. And it's not the same place because of you. And I'm not—" He looked at his hands on the table. "I'm not the same person I was in October, and I know whose work that is too." The kitchen was very quiet. Margaret was looking at him with an expression he had not seen before. Not the clear, steady attention she turned on problems to be solved. Not the quiet warmth she allowed herself in unguarded moments, but something more complicated and more vulnerable than either. Something that had cost her something to let him see. "Silas," she said carefully. "I know how this sounds," he said. "I know we started as— I know what the arrangement was supposed to be. I know I'm the man who rode to the station to send you away." "You didn't send me away," she said. "No." He looked at her. "I didn't." A silence. She picked up her fork, then put it down again without eating. He watched her compose something, watched her find words for a thing that was clearly not simple to say. "I am 52 years old," she said finally. "I know how old you are. People our age—" She stopped, started again. "The world has very decided opinions about what is and isn't possible for people our age, about what we've missed and what we're owed and what would be—" She pressed her lips together briefly. "Foolish. What people think has not been your primary guide up to this point," he said. Something moved at the corner of her mouth. Not quite a smile. Close. "No," she said. "But this is—" She looked at the table. "This is different from what people think. This is what I think." "Then tell me," he said. She was quiet for long enough that he heard the creak through the open window and the first crickets of summer starting up outside, and somewhere in the dark hills a coyote making its commentary on the evening. "I have been—" she began carefully. "For 6 years since Robert died, I have been very careful not to want things, not large things. Because large things, expecting large things, had only ever cost me." She looked up at him. and for the first time since October, he saw something in her face that was not composed, not managed, not shaped by the discipline of a woman who has taught herself that composure is safety. It was rawness, real and unguarded. I got very good at not wanting. It is actually quite a manageable way to live. No large disappointments. And no large anything else, he said. She looked at him. No, she said quietly. No large anything else. He reached across the table. He put his hand over hers slowly enough that she could move away if she chose to, and she did not move away. Her hand was still. Not tense, but still, the way a person is still when they are deciding whether to trust something that looks, against all prior evidence, like it might be real. I am not offering you an arrangement, he said. I am not offering you security or practicality or a sensible solution to mutual circumstances. He held her gaze. I'm telling you that I wake up in the morning and the first thing I think about is what you'll notice today that I've missed. I'm telling you that this house sounds right now in a way it hasn't sounded since Clara died, and I'm not confusing you with her. You are nothing like her, and that is not what I mean. I mean that something is alive in this house again that I'd stopped believing could be. He paused. That's what I'm offering, whatever that's worth. She looked at him for a long time. He waited the way she had taught him to wait, without filling the silence, without pressing, giving it the room it needed. I'm not an easy woman, she said. I noticed. I have opinions about everything. Also noticed. And I will continue to tell you when the fence posts are leaning. I depend on it, he said. Her hand turned under his, slowly, until her fingers were against his palm. That was all. That was everything. I am terrified, she said. The words were nearly a whisper, as if saying them quietly made them less dangerous. I want you to know that. I'm not someone who is easily terrified, but this, she looked at their hands. This terrifies me. Me too, he said. She looked up. You've been frightened this whole time? She said. Since the station platform, he said honestly. Since you told me you had $15 and nowhere to go and looked at me like you were perfectly prepared to manage with neither. She stared at him. Then, for the first time, the very first time since the train platform in October, Margaret Whitlock laughed. Not a polite sound, not a controlled one, but a real laugh, surprised out of her, and it transformed her face entirely in a way that hit Silas somewhere behind his sternum with the specific force of something he recognized but had not expected. I was not perfectly prepared, she said when she had recovered. I was comprehensively terrified and doing my absolute best to hide it. You hid it extremely well, he said. Years of practice, she said, and then the laughter faded into something softer, something that stayed in her eyes and around her mouth in the particular way that feeling does when it has nowhere left to hide. She looked at him with the most unguarded expression he had ever seen on her face. Silas. Yes. I would like to stay, she said, not as an arrangement, not because there's nowhere else. She squeezed his hand once, firmly, the way she did everything, with intention, without excess. Because I want to be here. Because this is... She looked around the kitchen, at the reorganized shelves and the mended floor and the ledgers on the sideboard and the window with its view of the creek catching the last of the twilight outside. This is where I want to be. He looked at her for a moment. Then stay, he said. Yes, she said simply. They did not announce anything. They were not people who announced things. What changed was visible in the dailiness of life, rather than in any ceremony of declaration, in the way they moved through the house differently, with less of the careful spatial diplomacy they had maintained through the winter, in the conversations that now ran longer and covered territory that had previously been fenced off by mutual unspoken agreement. He told her about Clara, not the facts he'd mentioned before, the date of death, the quality of character, but the stories. The soup on the floor, the way she'd read to him in the evenings from whatever book she was working through, making no accommodation for his preferences, but somehow always choosing things he ended up glad he'd heard. The way she'd laughed at her own jokes before she finished telling them, which had driven him nearly to madness, and which he now missed with a specificity that sometimes still ambushed him in the quiet moments. Margaret listened without interrupting, without the polite forward-leaning attention of someone waiting to respond. She listened the way she did everything she cared about, completely, with her whole attention, storing it away in the careful archive of herself. You loved her very specifically, she said when he was finished. He turned that over. Yes, he said. That's exactly right. That's the kind of love worth having, she said. The specific kind. The other kind, she considered. The other kind, the general warmth and affection kind, is fine. It sustains people. But the specific kind is rare, and it leaves a specific absence when it goes, which is why the arithmetic never helps. He looked at her. Robert, he said. She told him. Not everything at once. She was not built for the all at once. But over the following evenings, in pieces, the way you give someone a picture by filling in sections over time until the whole of it becomes clear. Robert Whitlock had been a quiet man, steadier than exciting, who had loved his farm and his wife with the reliable constancy of someone for whom loyalty was not a decision but a constitution. He had been good to her. He had not been effortless. They'd had their wars, their cold silences, their separate griefs over the children they'd wanted and hadn't had. But he had been good. I thought that was all there would ever be, she said one evening. One person, one life, and then the management of the remainder. She was mending by lamplight, a practiced motion she could do without looking. I had completely reorganized my understanding of what was possible. And now, he said. She looked at him over her mending with that clear, steady gaze. Now I think I was working with incomplete information, she said. It was Edna who forced the next thing, as Edna had forced everything from the beginning. She arrived in the first week of July without warning, which was consistent with every other action she had taken in this matter. She came on the Tuesday train to Larkspur Bend and hired a wagon out to the ranch, and Silas saw her from the field before she arrived. A small, formidable figure in a good traveling coat, sitting in the wagon seat with the posture of someone who has made a decision and is arriving to execute it. He went to meet her at the gate. Don't say anything, Edna said, climbing down from the wagon with the agility of a woman who refuses to be slowed by 61 years. I have heard everything, the water business, the hearing, all of it. The entire county has been writing letters, apparently, because I received 4 of them from people I barely know. She fixed him with the look she had been deploying against him since he was 7 years old. Where is she? In the house, he said. Good. Edna started toward the house. Edna, I am going to talk to her, Silas. Don't hover. He did not hover. He went back to the field and tried to focus on the fence post he'd been assessing and managed approximately nothing for the 45 minutes that his sister and Margaret were inside together. When he finally went in for water, he found them at the kitchen table with coffee between them, and the particular quality of the room told him, before either of them spoke, that something had been established. Edna looked at him with an expression that was, by her standards, almost soft. She's better than I expected, Edna said, by way of greeting, speaking as if Margaret were not sitting directly beside her. And I expected well. I'm sitting right here, Margaret said pleasantly. I know you are. Edna turned back to her. My brother is not a demonstrative man. He never has been. He requires, she considered, patience and directness in equal measure. I had noticed, Margaret said. He also requires someone to tell him when he's being a fool. Clara did that. He needs it. Edna, Silas said. You do, Edna said without looking at him. She looked at Margaret. Has he said what he needs to say? Yes, Margaret said. Edna looked at Silas, back at Margaret. Then what is the situation? Edna said. It was not quite a question, a silence. Margaret looked at Silas across the table. He looked back at her. We haven't... He stopped. He had, in fact, not quite managed the final formality of the thing. He had said what he felt. He had not asked what, in that era and that place, and the particular dignity of both their histories, needed to be asked. He pulled out the chair beside Margaret and sat down. Edna watched this with the satisfaction of a general observing a campaign proceeding as planned. Margaret, Silas said. Yes, she said. I know I am not the easiest man to... You're fine, she said. I want to... He looked at her. I'm asking you to marry me. The kitchen was quiet. Outside the window, the summer afternoon was bright, and the creek was audible, and the fields were full of the golden light that comes in Montana in July, when everything that has survived the winter is finally, completely alive. Margaret looked at him for a moment with the expression he had come to love most, the one that was not quite composed, the one that let him see all the way to the complicated, strong, unglamorous truth of her. "You are aware," she said, "that I already told you yes." "That was staying," he said. "This is different." She considered this distinction with the seriousness it apparently warranted. "Yes," she said, "it is different." A pause. "All right then, yes." Edna, who had sat through all of this with impressive restraint, said, "Finally," with a feeling that suggested the word had been building pressure for some time. "No one asked you," Silas said. "No one ever asks me," Edna said serenely. "I act anyway. It has generally worked out." Margaret looked at her with something that might, in a less reserved person, have been called affection. "Thank you," she said, "for the telegram, for all of it." "Don't thank me," Edna said. "Just be good to each other. That's the whole of it." The summer moved through its long gold days with the peaceful industry of a ranch in its right season, well managed, its animals healthy, its water secure, its accounts sound. There was still more work than there were hours, but it was the sustainable kind of more, the kind that produces a ranch rather than consuming one. But the nights were where the real change lived. After Edna had gone back to Billings, after the day's work was done, and the supper cleared and the lamplight came down to its evening warmth, they sat together in the house that had been hollow for 5 years and was hollow no longer, and they talked. About everything, in the way of two people who have spent decades with limited access to a person who genuinely wants to hear them. About the pasts they carried and the futures they were, improbably and with considerable work, still building. About the ranch, always the ranch, because it was the language they'd learned first and spoke most fluently. About the world as they'd encountered it, and the considerable ways it had failed to be what they'd hoped for, and the surprising ways it had exceeded expectation. One evening, late in July, with the summer dark full outside and the window open to the warm air and the creek running its endless conversation in the distance, Margaret said, "I used to believe that the significant chapters of a life had a natural number, that there were only so many of them, and I'd had mine." "And now?" he said. She was quiet for a moment. "Now I think that was a failure of imagination on my part," she said, "which is unlike me. I'm generally quite good at thinking around corners." "Generally," he agreed. She looked at him sideways. "The best ones begin when the world is convinced they're already over," she said. "That seems to be the way of it." He thought about October, about the train platform and the cold wind, and a woman standing alone with a worn suitcase, and the decision he'd made that he hadn't understood he was making until long after it was made. "Yes," he said, "that does seem to be the way of it." Outside, the creek ran on through the summer dark, over stones that had been there since before either of them were born and would be there long after, carrying the cold, clear water of the high country down through the valley that was theirs by law and by labor and by the particular grace of two people who had found each other at the exact moment when both of them had stopped expecting to. The lamp burned low. Neither of them moved to turn it up. The night settled around them, warm and full and unambiguously alive. And the Boone Ranch sat in the Montana summer like something that has finally become what it was always supposed to be. Not just a working operation, not just a piece of land with a legal claim and a creek and a sound roof, but a home. The real kind. The specific kind. The kind that leaves a specific warmth in the air long after the lamp has gone to dark. They married on a Saturday in the second week of April, 1886. 1 year and 5 months after a woman with a worn suitcase had stepped off a train onto a cold platform in Larkspur Bend and changed the shape of everything. The ceremony was held beside the creek. It was Margaret's idea, and she had stated it with the same matter-of-fact certainty she brought to fence posts and supply costs, as if the location were simply the obvious practical choice and not, as Silas understood it to be, a deliberate act of meaning. The creek they had fought for. The water that was theirs by right and by record, and by the particular courage of a woman who had known where to look when looking mattered most. It seemed right to stand beside it when they made the thing official. It seemed like the truest possible place. The morning was cold and bright, the way April mornings in Montana are when they are being kind. The air sharp enough to remind you that winter has not entirely released its claim, but the sunlight generous enough to make you believe, with good reason, in the season coming. The creek ran high with snowmelt, loud and purposeful, and the first green was coming up along its banks in the thin, vivid way of early spring growth that is more conviction than substance, but no less beautiful for that. Edna had come from Billings, of course. She would not have missed it for anything available on earth. She wore her best coat and an expression of such profound self-satisfaction that Silas spent most of the morning making a deliberate effort not to look directly at her, the way you avoid looking at the sun. Tom Birch came with his wife and two of their grown sons. Carver, the land attorney, had sent a letter of congratulation from Billings, formal and warm in equal measure. A handful of neighbors came, ranchers and their families from up and down the valley, people who had spent the previous winter revising their understanding of Margaret Whitlock and had arrived, by various routes of reckoning, at something resembling admiration. Even Gruber came, which surprised Silas and appeared to surprise Gruber himself. The justice of the peace was a man named Aldridge, who had been performing this office in Larkspur Bend for 12 years, and had developed in that time the particular gentleness of someone who has watched enough people begin things to understand how much the beginning matters. He stood at the creek bank with Silas and Margaret before him, and spoke the words without elaboration or excess, which was exactly right. Silas had thought he would be nervous. He was not. He was, in the clear morning air beside the water he had almost lost, in front of the people who had watched and doubted and ultimately witnessed, holding the hands of a woman he had once ridden 12 miles to send away. He was simply, and without qualification, certain. It was the particular quality of certainty that comes not from the absence of difficulty, but from having moved through difficulty and found what holds on the other side. He looked at Margaret. She was looking back at him with the clear, steady gaze that had faced down train platforms and cold winds and hostile towns and powerful men in the long interior weather of her own doubt and grief, and which was doing none of those things now. She was simply looking at him, present and unguarded in the particular way she allowed herself to be, these days, in the moments that mattered. "I do," she said, when it was time, in a voice that carried across the sound of the creek without effort. Edna, standing 3 feet to Silas's left, made a sound that she immediately disguised as a cough. Nobody believed it was a cough. Silas looked at his sister and she looked at him, and the expression on her face, unrepeatable, fierce with love, incandescent with the satisfaction of a woman who had sent a telegram and changed 2 lives and knew it, was something he would carry with him for the rest of his days. The wedding supper was held at the ranch in the yard behind the house, with tables borrowed from the church hall and food that seemed to have materialized from the collective generosity of every household that had shown up. Tom Birch's wife had brought 3 pies. Mrs. Paulson, who had become one of Margaret's quiet allies over the winter months, had contributed a ham of considerable ambition. Someone had brought 2 jugs of a local production that Silas accepted without asking for provenance, and which proved entirely adequate to the occasion. There was fiddle music. One of the Birch sons played, and he played well, and the yard filled with the sound of it cutting bright and clean through the April evening. Silas danced once with Edna, who danced the way she did everything, leading, decisive, tolerating no ambiguity about direction. He danced twice with Margaret, who had told him she was not much of a dancer and proved to be considerably better than she'd claimed, which surprised him only briefly before he recognized it as entirely consistent. "You said you weren't much of a dancer," he said during the second. "I said I wasn't much of a dancer," she said. "I didn't say I was bad at it." "That is a meaningful distinction." "Most distinctions are," she said, and he felt the same thing he always felt when she said something like that. The particular warmth of being in the company of a mind he had not finished learning. Later in the evening, when the fire had burned lower and the music had slowed and some of the guests had gone, and the ones who remained were in the comfortable, unhurried mode of people who have eaten well and feel no urgency. Tom Birch found Silas at the edge of the yard and stood beside him, looking out at the creek in the darkness. "Good evening," Tom said. "Yes," Silas said. They were quiet together for a while in the easy way of men who have known each other through enough seasons to have moved past the requirement of words. "You almost didn't go to that station," Tom said. Silas looked at him. "How do you know that?" Tom's mouth did something that wasn't quite a smile. "Because I know you," he said. "And because if you'd gone with an open heart, you'd have brought her home the same day and we'd have heard about it sooner." He looked at the darkness. "You went to say no, and you came back with her anyway. I've been curious about that since October." Silas thought about the platform, the emptying crowd, the wind coming off the hills, a woman standing alone with a worn suitcase, watching a train pull away without drama, without tears, with a spine like something forged rather than grown. She was standing there, he said, after the train left, just standing there. She wasn't performing anything. She wasn't asking for anything. She was just, he paused, present, in a situation that would have undone most people, and she was just completely, quietly present. Tom nodded slowly. And you couldn't leave that, he said. No, Silas said. I couldn't leave that. Tom was quiet for a moment. Then, she saved this place, Silas. I know. I don't mean the water, I mean, Tom gestured, not very specifically, in the direction of the house, the fields, the whole of it. All of it. The way it's running now, the way you're running now. He looked at him directly, in the way Tom Birch looked at things he wanted to be understood. We were worried about you, me and some others. The ranch was going in a direction that only had one end. Silas said nothing. He knew it was true. She turned it, Tom said. Both of you, together. He picked up his glass. It's good to see, that's all. They stood in companionable silence while the fiddle started up again behind them, and the spring night carried on its business, and the creek said what it always said to anyone paying attention, which was simply, I am here, I am moving, I am going where I have always been going, which is, if you listen to it long enough, the only useful thing anyone has ever said about time. The 3 years that followed were the best years Boone Ranch had ever seen. This is not a romanticized assessment. It is a practical one, measurable in the kind of terms that a Montana frontier ranch understood. Livestock numbers, acreage, productivity, account balances, the quality of the fences and the soundness of the water supply, and the reliability of the operation through both good seasons and difficult ones. By any of these measures, the ranch that Margaret and Silas built together between 1886 and 1889 was not the fading thing it had been in the autumn of 1884. It was something different in kind. The herd grew from 43 to over 100 head, through a combination of careful breeding selection that Margaret had researched and proposed and Silas had executed, and through the kind of management that prevents the losses that accumulate invisibly until they are catastrophic. The supply arrangements she had renegotiated continued to produce savings that were reinvested in equipment and infrastructure, a new barn section, a proper root cellar, improvements to the irrigation from the creek that extended their productive acreage into fields that had previously been too dry for reliable grazing. The accounts, which Margaret maintained with the same focused precision she had brought to them from her first night at the kitchen table, were not merely sound but growing. The outstanding debts that had been quietly bleeding the operation had been collected and closed. New relationships with buyers in Great Falls had been established through a correspondence campaign that Margaret had conducted with the thoroughness of a military operation, and the prices they received for their cattle improved accordingly. Cully, the hired hand who had come 3 days a week from down the valley, came 5 days a week instead. A second hand was hired in the spring of 1887. A young man named Pete Sorensen from a Norwegian family newly arrived in the county, who turned out to be one of those people who are instinctively excellent with animals and who attached himself to the operation with the particular loyalty of someone who has found a place where competence is valued. Margaret liked Pete. She had the quality, which Silas had come to understand was not universal, of being entirely without condescension toward young people who were trying to learn things. She taught without performing teaching, simply did the thing correctly in a way that made the correct way visible, and answered questions with the respect of someone who believes that the question deserves a real answer. Pete Sorensen took note of everything she did, and within a year was doing half of it on his own, and asking intelligent questions about the other half. He'll run his own place someday, Margaret said one evening. Hopefully not too soon, Silas said. Hopefully not, she agreed, but when he does, he'll do it well. She looked satisfied by this, in the particular way she was satisfied by things that were built to last. The valley around them was changing too. The county was growing, new families, new operations, the railroad bringing people and commerce at an accelerating pace that was simultaneously exciting and vertiginous. The frontier that Silas had known as a young man, the open, lawless, provisional frontier, was closing in the way frontiers do, replaced by something more settled, more institutional, more connected to the wider world. This had costs and benefits in roughly equal measure, and Silas and Margaret argued about its implications with the comfortable vigor of two people who are not afraid of disagreement between them. What the growing county also brought was neighbors with problems that looked to an increasing number of people, like problems Margaret had already solved. It started modestly. A young rancher named Garrett, no relation to Holloway, a coincidence of naming that produced a brief awkward moment at their first meeting, came to ask about supply sourcing. Margaret spent an afternoon with him at the kitchen table going through his accounts with the same unflinching clarity she'd brought to Silas's ledgers in October of 1884, and he left with a reorganized understanding of where his money was going and a list of contacts that would materially improve the situation within a season. He sent his brother the following spring. His brother sent his father-in-law. It expanded from there in the organic, unannounced way that reputation expands when it is built on something real. People came to the ranch, not in large numbers, not formally, but steadily, with the particular problems of frontier agricultural life. Account questions, supply questions, water right questions, the complex legal and practical puzzles of building an operation on land that was still working out its rules. Margaret received all of them with the same quality of attention she brought to her own work, at the kitchen table or on the porch or walking the fields, explaining and analyzing and occasionally making connections that the person asking had not thought to make. She never charged for it. Silas, who understood the value of what she was doing perhaps more clearly than anyone, once suggested she consider it. She had given him a look. "These are neighbors," she said, "neighbors with problems you're spending time to solve." "Then there'll be neighbors who solve their problems," she said, in the tone that indicated the conversation was complete. He did not raise it again. What he did do, without announcing it, was begin keeping a different kind of record. Not the accounts. Those were Margaret's domain, and she knew their state at any moment with the precision of a navigator who has memorized the stars. But a quieter record, kept in the back of his own ledger in his own less elegant hand. The names of the people who came, the problems they brought, the outcomes he heard about afterward when he encountered them in town or in the field. The list grew with the years, and it was, by any measure he could apply to it, a remarkable document, not because it recorded anything dramatic, but because it recorded something consistent. People came with broken things and left with the tools to fix them. Margaret did not know he kept this record. He did not tell her. It was his own accounting, private, quietly kept, the way a man sometimes holds a truth about someone he loves, not because it is a secret, but because some things are best carried internally, where they warm you from inside. In the spring of 1888, 3.5 years after a Tuesday telegram had arrived from Billings and changed the course of 2 lives, Silas Boone stood on the porch of his house in the long golden light of a May evening and looked at the land. The cattle were in the south pasture, the new herd, larger, healthier, better bred than anything his father had run on this land. The fields were green and full, the winter wheat coming up in the east section that had been dry waste 2 years ago before the irrigation work. The barn stood solid and well-maintained against the hillside, its northeast corner no longer a problem, its hayloft full from the previous season's surplus. The creek ran, bright and constant, along the valley's edge, carrying its cold, irreplaceable water through land that knew it was theirs. He heard the screen door and Margaret came to stand beside him on the porch. She had a coffee cup in each hand and she gave him one without asking if he wanted it, because she had known for 3.5 years that he always wanted coffee in the evenings on the porch, and he had known for 3.5 years that she would bring it, and neither of them thought about this anymore because it was simply part of the grammar of their shared life. They stood and looked at the land together. After a while she said, "Pete asked me today about the ridge section, whether we've thought about expanding the herd up there now that the water right is confirmed." "What did you tell him?" "I told him it was worth considering in the next season if the prices hold." She sipped her coffee. "He's ready for more responsibility. He doesn't know that yet, but he is." "He knows more than you think he does," Silas said. "He knows a great deal," she agreed. "He just hasn't learned to trust what he knows yet. That comes." She looked out at the fields. "It takes time to trust what you've learned. It took me long enough." He glanced at her sideways. "What?" she said, reading him with the ease of long practice. "Nothing," he said. "I was just thinking about October." She made a small sound, not quite a laugh, but its cousin. You and your Tuesdays. It was a Tuesday. Everything significant in your life happens on a Tuesday, which is statistically improbable. Or significant days make themselves known, he said, and Tuesdays have always been willing. She turned to look at him with the expression he loved best, not the composed, forward-facing attention she turned on problems, but the private one, the one that had taken months to surface, and that, once it had never entirely gone back under. I was terrified, she said, standing on that platform. I want you to know that. I've told you before, but I want you to know it fully. I was comprehensively, thoroughly frightened. When the train left and there was no one there, she paused. I had no plan. I had $15 in a suitcase, and I told you a very calm story about managing until Monday morning, and every word of it was true, and also I had no idea how I would actually manage until Monday morning. I know, he said. You knew then? I suspected, he said. The composure was very good, but there was something around the edges of it. She looked at him. Why didn't you say so? Because, he said, it seemed like the composure was something you needed to be able to keep. So I let you keep it. She was quiet for a long moment. Silas Boone, she said, in the tone she used when he had surprised her, which still happened, and which he still found that he valued more than almost anything. What? He said. You have always been considerably more perceptive than you let on, she said. I learned from watching a very perceptive woman. She turned back to the view, but he could see the side of her face and what was on it. And what was on it was the thing that had no single word, the complex, layered, specific happiness of a person who has arrived somewhere they never expected to arrive and understands, with full clarity, how unlikely the journey was and how completely worth it. The evening light moved across the fields in the long, unhurried way of spring light in Montana, gold deepening toward amber, the hills going warm and soft at their edges, the creek catching the last of it and throwing it back in slow-moving pieces across the valley floor. I used to stand here and see what was failing, Silas said. Every evening, I'd stand here and take inventory of everything that was going wrong, everything I couldn't keep up with, everything that was slipping. He looked at the land. I stopped noticing when that changed. When did it change? She said. He thought about it honestly. The morning after the December storm, he said. When we got the cattle back in and you stood on this porch in the first sunlight and you said it always does about spring coming. He paused. After that, something was different after that. She remembered. He could see it on her face, the recognition of a specific moment retrieved from the accumulated record of shared days. I didn't know you were watching, she said. I was always watching, he said, from the beginning. I couldn't seem to stop. She was quiet for a moment. Then she said with the plain simplicity she reserved for the truest things, neither could I. Below them, in the south pasture, one of the cattle made its evening commentary on nothing in particular. Pete Sorensen crossed the yard toward the barn, his work done for the day, lifting a hand toward the porch as he passed. The creek ran its constant, patient course. The hills held their light as long as they could before releasing it to the dark. They stood on the porch until the stars came out, which in Montana in May takes a long time, and neither of them minded. Years later, many years, more than either of them had counted on having, the story of Boone Ranch and the woman who had arrived at Larkspur Bend Station with a worn suitcase was told throughout the valley the way certain stories get told when they have earned their place in a community's understanding of itself. Not as legend, not as romance exactly, though it was that too, but as evidence, as demonstration of a proposition that people needed, periodically, to see proven again, that it is never too late, that capability is not the property of the young, that the right two people, arriving at the right moment with the willingness to look carefully at what they have found, can build something out of a failing ranch and a cold platform and a telegram sent without permission that will outlast both of them by a considerable distance. The young ranchers who sought Margaret's counsel in those years carried what she taught them into their own operations, and some of them taught it to their children, and the chain of that practical wisdom ran forward through the valley in ways that Margaret never tracked and never claimed, because she had never done any of it for the claiming. The ranch itself went on, sound and well-run, its water secure, its land worked with the care of people who understand that the land is not theirs in the absolute sense, but has been lent to them on the condition that they leave it better than they found it. The tin box that had held Frederick Aldous Marsh's 1853 survey was kept on the shelf in the back room, no longer buried under crates but placed deliberately, with access. Margaret had rewrapped the documents in fresh oilskin. She checked them periodically, the way you check the things that have proven their value. The stain on the kitchen floor, the one that Clara's soup had made and that Silas had never quite gotten out, remained. Margaret had seen it on her first evening and had not commented on it and had not tried to remove it. Silas, understanding this, had never explained it. Some things did not need to be explained. Some things were allowed to simply remain, held in the house the way a house holds everything that has happened inside it. Not as ghosts, but as the layered record of a life accumulated, sorrow and joy, and loss and love, pressing themselves into the walls and the floors, and the particular quality of the light in the morning coming through the east window. That window with its faded curtains, which had been too far gone to do anything with when Margaret arrived, had new curtains by the second winter. She had made them herself, from cloth she'd ordered through the Halverson catalog, a practical blue-gray that suited the room without making any claims it couldn't support. She had replaced them without comment, the way she did things, because they needed doing, because she was there, because the house was hers now in the only way that houses are ever truly anyone's, which is through the daily, unremarkable, irreplaceable act of care. On an evening in the summer of the 6th year, Silas came in from the fields to find Margaret standing at the east window the way he had found her that November afternoon when she had told him Robert's name for the first time. The same stillness, the same slight distance in the eyes. He did not say anything. He came and stood beside her. Outside the window, the light was coming down across the valley in long gold lines, the way it did in summer at the end of a clear day, and the creek was visible in the middle distance, and the cattle were moving slowly across the far pasture with the unhurried dignity of animals that know they are well kept. "What are you thinking?" he asked after a while. She looked at the window a moment longer. Then she looked at him. "I was thinking," she said, "about the station platform, about standing there after the train left." She paused. "I was trying to remember exactly what I felt, so I don't forget it." "Why?" "Because it matters," she said. "That exact feeling of standing in a place you weren't wanted, with nothing but what you came with, not knowing what the next hour was going to look like." She looked back out the window. "I want to keep remembering it, because it's the before. And the before is what makes—" She gestured, not very specifically, in the direction of all of it. The window, the light, the fields, the creek, the house, and everything in it. This. He stood beside her in the window's light and looked at what they had made, the two of them, out of a bad October Tuesday and a woman who had nowhere to go, and a man who had ridden out to refuse the future and brought it home instead. "The before," he said. "Yes," she said. "You have to keep the before, otherwise you don't understand what you're standing in." He put his arm around her shoulders, and she leaned into it, the slight, easy lean of someone who has learned that there are people you can lean on, and that learning it is not weakness but its own particular kind of strength, perhaps the rarest kind, the kind that requires the most of you, the kind that can only be arrived at through the long discipline of loss and the harder discipline of hope. Outside, the light continued its slow, inevitable work across the valley. The creek ran on. The cattle grazed. The ranch breathed in and out with the steady rhythm of something that has found its right shape and settled into it completely, like a stone worn smooth by water, not diminished by what it has been through, but defined by it, made more entirely itself. This was Boone Ranch. This was what remained. This was enough. More than enough. More than either of them, standing alone on separate platforms in the cold October of their separate losses, had thought to hope for. They stood at the window together until the light was gone. Then Margaret said, "Supper," in the practical, specific tone she used for things that needed doing. "Yes," said Silas. They turned from the window and moved back into the warmth of the house, and the door closed behind them, and the lamp came on in the kitchen, and from outside, if anyone had been standing in the summer dark to see it, the light from that window would have looked like exactly what it was, a home, occupied, alive, entirely and at last itself. The end.